Titus with Reclaimed Lumber Products. We had an opportunity here to give you a side-by-side comparison of two interior paneling projects that we were doing on the same project. Both are working with a whitewash paneling. It's a pine fir mix, mostly pine, and it was an example that we get a lot of questions for every day. Should I do a tongue and groove product, or the alternative is the thin wood paneling product that we make that's meant to be glued and nailed up over a substrate such as OSB or plywood. We decided to experiment with the project and do two at the same time using very similar materials in an experiment with how the application would go. So the tongue and groove product is a thicker product. It's a 3/4 to 7/8 thick. It has a 1/4 inch tongue on it. And it is a structural product that can apply directly over the studs or some other greater gaps than the thin wood product is a 3/8 thick only with square edges. So if you compare the two, with the tongue and groove, you have to mate similar profiles together, which would mean that you would have to put the female and the male part together whenever you do a side profile. A butt joint with the square edge, 3/8 is all four sides are square edge, so that means you can cut it anywhere and butt it up against the piece next to it, and it will always be a square edge, which means you don't have to make profiles. There's different advantages to both, and we'll try to go through those pros and cons. The advantage of using the thicker product is that you don't have to put it up over a substrate. It's structurally sound on its own, so you don't have the cost of doing the OSB or plywood underneath it. The disadvantage of it is that it is very labor consuming to install. And usually the wood walls are not flat, and so you will be fighting to apply over the studs that have big gaps behind them and try to get the wall flat. And trying to make those profiles together takes a lot of time. If you, alternatively, if you're putting up the thin wood product, the OSB plywood substrate flattens the wall, smooths it out. You can start and stop a board anywhere you'd like. And it goes up very fast and easy that way, and has a greater yield and less waste. And the truth of the matter is that the OSB and plywood, like on our project, when we compared cost, the installed cost of the OSB was less than 60 cents for labor and materials. That was cheaper than the alternative cost between manufacturing the thicker wood product and the thinner wood product. So that alone was a cost savings, not counting the labor savings. We estimate that the thin wood product will probably go up 4 or 5 times faster than trying to make the tongue and groove product and put it up. And so in the long run, you will be money ahead and much quicker on your install doing the thin wood product over the tongue and groove. We'll show you a few techniques and installation steps that you can experiment with doing both. We can offer you both products, and we'd be glad to help you walk you down either one of these paths. Here's an example of how it's difficult to install directly on the studs, because typically the walls are not perfectly flat. It's not at all unusual to have gaps like this behind the boards where one's in and out. And then when you try to nail to it, either your board must give or it gaps over the top of it. Some other tricks to consider is when you're going up against the sheetrock, say you're butting into an edge like this right here, start with this joint, because typically it's not 90 degrees and you need to make it look pretty where you're trying to go into the sheetrock, and oftentimes you need to cut it at an angle other than 90 degrees. So you don't know what that angle is going to be, and you might have to cope it to fit. So get this angle cut first, and then your joint that butts into another board down here is most likely going to be 90 degrees. And so cut your hard to cut ones up against the wall or difficult to reach ones, get them cut first, and then it's like drawing to an inside straight, but you can always measure this and cut this one later. So in this case, we have a board that's butting into another board down there, but instead of trying to measure it and transfer the mark over with a tape measure, sometimes it's just easier to make your mark yourself and then visually see it, and then we'll cut that one 90 degrees. Same thing here. If we were cutting against this sheetrock, and let's say we were going there and then we're cutting here, I would get this joint made first, I'd come over here, and then I'd cut this last one last that goes into another board. Another thing that we learned on this is we had the ability to pre-cut all of our boards to 16-inch increments, which is our typical stud spacing, and then theoretically you can take a board and put it on 16-inch increments, and then it's always going to land on a board. Well, what we learned with using the tongue and groove product is that sounds good in theory and on paper, but in all application it doesn't really work. And so people often think you have to catch studs. Well, it's actually kind of harder to catch the studs. That's the advantage of putting up the 3/8 product, is going over a plywood substrate. You don't care if you're catching studs, you don't care if you're nailing into it, because you're typically gluing it up and your plywood's already nailed out and has flattened the wall. But in the case of this thicker product, what you have to do is you have to make sure there's at least one nail in the stud. And oftentimes it's easier to only have one nail and have your links stop random past the studs, because if you try to catch on a stud, you really only have 3/4 of an inch anyway, and it's too hard to get this nail toe-nailed in on each edge right there where you have such a small nailing point. Versus if it's in the middle of the board like this, you can nail right there and it doesn't split out the end of the board. And what I find is that with the tongue and the groove, they actually lock it into place, and you can add a little glue if you want to. And the board could almost float in there with no nails anyway. So instead of trying to have all your patterns cut and land perfectly on studs, just ignore them, nail to the studs as you go, but run your pieces wild and random, and then you'll have a better yield because you're not trying to cut every board specifically to land on a stud. And what you can do with those random patterns then is use 100% of the length of the board, and it can go past a stud and stop randomly with each row. And then when you just get to the end of the run, you cut it when it gets to the wall. And like I said, you typically do your wall ends first because they're your critical joints that are going to show, and then you work back to the inside. Here's a board that's not quite ideal. It has a little crack in it, but since this is non-structural and we have solid backing, we can still utilize the board by gluing it and nailing it in place. Because once the glue cures, the nails are really there, don't really matter. So once the glue cures, the nails don't matter anymore because we've glued it off solid. There's this crack, and it looks like the board's a little flex, but we put extra glue on each side, and then we just go ahead and attach it to the backing. And we're doing a random pattern here, and the nails go on super easy. There's nothing particularly different about it. We just do maybe one in each end. They're little tiny pin nails. They're not going to show. And it's up, and that's it.